Hello again, and welcome to the third online lecture for MSIN 0020, Strategy by Design. This week, we begin to think about how to do strategic analysis. What we cover in this and next week's lectures, sync sessions, and readings is designed to inform your thinking, research, and presentation for the written assignments. Last week, we talked about goals and values, what strategy aims to achieve. I said then that goals are the foundation of strategy. You can't understand or make good strategy without understanding them. This is because a business's strategy necessarily changes based on what goals it pursues. But let's say we already understand the goals a business is pursuing. Thereafter, in order to develop strategy, that is to say, a plan of action to achieve specified goals, you have to undertake strategic analysis. In its simplest form, strategic analysis is thinking about and understanding a strategic situation. In other words, interpreting a strategic situation so you can act on it to achieve your goals. Remembering that strategic analysis is about making sense of a situation, today's lecture covers two areas that affect how we make sense of any situation so that we can act on it. The first is what type of goal is being pursued, and the second is what type of situation we're working in. So, first, types of goals. Goals are simply what outcomes or states we desire, but different types of goals have different implications for how we take action to achieve them. This is particularly true under conditions of uncertainty. So all achievable goals are conceptually easy to achieve when you are certain about the possible actions you can take and the outcomes those actions will produce. But in a situation of uncertainty, some goals are easier to achieve than others. So when it isn't clear or certain what the future will be, some types of goals give you more capacity to achieve them than other types of goals do. So I want to distinguish here between two types of goals: superordinate, higher level or more abstract goals, and subordinate, lower level, more concrete goals. Which do you think is easier to achieve under uncertainty, and why? If you want, you can pause the video right here for a minute or two to think about it. Okay, now let's talk it through using an example. You may know this brand. The Gap was launched in the US in 1969, and it's sort of a low/medium price value brand there. Now, their expansion goal was to be the same kind of low/medium price value brand outside the US. But when they actually did expand, they discovered that in some countries, they were unsuccessful at competing in the value category because of their price point. It was low/medium in the US, but medium/high in some of the target markets. And their identity and branding was also not consistent with what value categories felt like in their target markets. So the Gap's goal was relatively subordinate and concrete. They knew what they wanted to be, and there was no sort of flex or flexibility for them to do anything different. It was very clearly and rigidly defined. And so when the Gap encountered market conditions that were not appropriate to their very concrete subordinate goal, they were unable to adapt to suit. So the Gap wasn't doing particularly well before coronavirus and is now doing very badly indeed. Now, in contrast, you all know this company quite well. It operates in the internet and retail industries, both of which are highly unpredictable and fast-moving. And it also operates in a wide range of countries around the world, so it has to face a wide range of business environments. As a global business, it faces unpredictability in that respect as well. But, unlike the Gap, Amazon has been successful in part because it has articulated to its employees an actually very high-level, abstract goal worldwide. This relatively superordinate goal can be summarized as achieve one or more of either greater selection, lower price, or quicker delivery. And what this does is it gives employees and the organization as a whole a relatively superordinated, abstract goal. And therefore, many types of products and services can be consistent with that superordinated, abstract goal. Amazon has not, like the Gap, over-defined and made too rigid what it means for Amazon to be successful. And this is how it's been successful in these highly unpredictable markets and this wide range of markets that it's gone into. Amazon and the Gap illustrate one aspect of strategic analysis, which is to begin by understanding what kind of goal is being pursued in the first place. Is it a relatively superordinate or a relatively subordinate goal? Superordinate goals are more abstract and higher level, and they're less rigidly defined. so they offer more opportunities to react to the situation as it changes. To be precise, relatively superordinate goals are easier to achieve because they offer more ability to respond to the particular resources and constraints of the situation, as well as newly discovered aspects of the situation. But it's important to point out that this is only comparatively useful when the situation is uncertain. When the situation is certain, relatively subordinate, in other words, concrete goals, like the ones that the gap was pursuing, that are clearly and rigidly defined, are easier to achieve conceptually. Other than types of goals, another consideration in strategic analysis is what kind of situation you're facing, whether you're facing a risky or an uncertain situation. This week's required reading explains the difference between risk and uncertainty. Risk is essentially not knowing exactly what the outcome will be, but knowing all the possible outcomes and all their probabilities. Uncertainty, on the other hand, is not knowing exactly what the outcome will be, and also not knowing what outcomes are possible, and or not knowing the probabilities of those outcomes. If you want more detail about the difference between risk and uncertainty and why it's important to distinguish between the two, you can take a look at the optional reading this week from Frank Knight. Now, this difference between risk and uncertainty means, in other words, that risk is really a form of certainty. You may not know what the actual outcome will be, but you know everything else about it. This gives us one major insight about strategic analysis, and that is, strategy is only conceptually difficult when you're in a situation of true uncertainty, not a situation of risk. I'm going to explain to you with examples why this is in the next few slides. So, you may want to take a little pause by stopping the video here to think about why this statement about uncertainty makes sense, especially in the context of superordinate and subordinate goals. If you recall from the first few weeks of lectures, I've defined strategy simply as choosing actions to achieve desired goals. If you have 100% certainty about what goals you're pursuing, and 100% certainty about what actions you should take to achieve those goals, then obviously choosing the actions to take is not hard. Although I should say that choosing the actions to take may not be hard, but implementing and actually executing on those actions may still be difficult. For instance, some of you may know this application. Let's make some heroic and unrealistic assumptions. Let's assume that Twitter has only one goal, and that goal is profit. It wants to maximize profit over the next 10 years. Given that this is Twitter's goal, let's again imagine that it's got two broad strategies. Option one is to focus 100% on becoming a market leader for real-time news discovery. Option two, in other words, strategy two, is to focus 100% on becoming a market-leading social network. The question here is, which option, if you are Twitter's strategy team, which option do you choose? Again, I just want to say this is just another way to ask which of these two strategies would you adopt? Would you focus 100% on becoming a market leader for real-time news discovery? Or would you focus 100% on becoming a market-leading social network? You may want to pause here again to do the math, which is fairly basic. Now, if you did the math, which is basically to calculate the expected profit from both options, then choose the one with the higher expected profit, you would have chosen option 2. The 10-year expected profit from option 2 is 400 million versus 374 million for option 1. But if you're being realistic, this whole scenario seems kind of comical, right? Because this kind of certainty about expected profit and about expectations in general seems impossible. You can never be sure that what you do leads with a 100% probability to these forecasted outcomes. So, this statement which you saw earlier is definitely true, even when things are probabilistically true rather than deterministically true. When you don't know for sure that something will happen, but when you know for sure how likely it is to happen. So let's consider the same situation except with a slight wrinkle, right? So previously, the probabilities of the outcomes for each of these two options was 100%, p equals 1. Now, we're in a world where the probabilities for option 1 and option 2 are not 1, but instead for option 1, it's 0.8, and for option 2, it's 0.74. What this means is option 1 has a probability of 80% of coming true, in other words, of getting that amount of profit in this 10-year window. And option 2 has a 74% probability of producing that 10-year profit that you see on the slide. You may want to pause to do the expected profit calculations now before deciding which option you would pursue in this case. So the 10-year expected profit given the probabilities of success for option 1 and 2 are 299 million for option 1, which is 374 times 0.8. Well, for option 2, the 10-year expected profit is 400 times 0.74, or 296 million. So this time, given that option 1 and option 2 are not 100% sure to work out, given that you know the probabilities of option 1 and 2, you would choose option 1 because it gives you the higher profit over 10 years in expectation. You don't know exactly what will happen, but you have something like perfect information about how likely each option is to work out as you would expect. So what you're in now is you're in a risky, not uncertain situation. And I can hear you thinking right now that even this is not really realistic. And I agree. So the only time when choosing actions, in other words, acting strategically, is conceptually difficult is when you're faced not just with risk, but with uncertainty. And this is why I said that one major insight from reading this week's readings is that strategy is only really conceptually difficult when you don't have perfect information about the future. And this is true even probabilistically, as I just showed you in the last slide. Let's try and take an even more realistic scenario of uncertainty, right? So from before, the 10-year expected profit for option 1 is 299 million. And for option 2, the expected profit over 10 years is 296 million. However, for option 3, you can't calculate the expected profit using the same method as for options 1 and 2. What do you choose to do in this situation if you had to choose only one of these 3 strategies for the next 10 years if you are the Twitter strategy team? The situation you're facing now is not really risk, and it's definitely not certainty. What this is a situation of uncertainty, true uncertainty, one of the kinds of true uncertainty that we're talking about today. So this third scenario is basically what most, maybe even all businesses face. We're generally unable to predict the efficacy of strategies with any certainty. And one way to illustrate this is to show how the enterprise value of Twitter changes dramatically over time as signaled by its stock price. This reflects the equity value component of enterprise value, if you recall this from last week's lecture. So if it were possible to understand how profitable something would be over time, you would expect that stock markets would be more predictable than they currently are, and share prices would be more predictable than they currently are. So what you see on the slide today is from July 2015, when in one day, the stock went from $36 a share with a 24 billion market cap to $31.24 at the end of the next day, a $21 billion market cap. This removed about $3 billion from market capitalization. Now, in September 2018, the market cap was still 22 billion. In October 2019, it had gone up to 30 billion, 8 billion up in the course of about a year. And now in October 2020, it's around 36 billion. It is so difficult to predict what effect actions will have on achieving even pretty clear singular goals like profit. This suggests that we are more often in situations of uncertainty than risk. And when in a situation of uncertainty, strategy becomes conceptually difficult. You don't have a clear way to decide on what actions to take because you don't have a clear way to understand the relationships between the actions you take and the results you achieve. And we haven't even talked yet about the difficulties of implementing strategy. So just to recap on the difference between risk and uncertainty, as you continue through this module, and especially as you work on your written assignments, you should consider whether conventional ideas of strategy requires the business applying them to face a situation of risk for which it is appropriate or not. In other words, you should ask yourself whether conventional ideas of strategy are applicable under the conditions of uncertainty in which we frequently find ourselves. And just to say it again, true uncertainty is when you don't know what's going to happen in the future in a way that cannot be measured and therefore cannot be eliminated. There's another form of uncertainty that is relevant to strategic analysis, and that's the uncertainty that arises from goals themselves. So true uncertainty derives from unmeasurably imperfect knowledge of outcomes. But a deeper form of true uncertainty is that which arises from uncertainty in what goals the organization wants. So we can return to the Twitter example to see what happens when goals are unclear and uncertain in this way. So let's assume that Twitter is surprisingly clear for a big corporation about what it's trying to achieve. It says it has two goals. The first one is to increase user numbers. They weight that at 30%. And this is secondary to their primary goal of increasing profit, which they weight at 70%. This seems more or less plausible, right? Because Twitter uses users in order to make money. Now, what the previous slide indicates in our imaginary strategic goal world is that in choosing between strategies 1 and 2, options 1 and 2, Twitter gives some weight to both how many users the strategy will get for it, as well as how much profit over 10 years that strategy will get for it. And it weights the users a bit under half as much as the profit. So with that in mind, now we're back at option 2 being the optimal one. The reason for this is if Twitter cares about both users and profit, and it cares about twice as much about profit as it does about users, option 2 gives it a little bit less profit than option 1, but way more users than option 1. So, if you were sort of trying to decide between strategy 1 and strategy 2 for Twitter, you would probably pick option 2. Even though users and profits aren't really comparable with each other, and we still don't really know what it means to weight two things that aren't really comparable with each other. Now, if you think back to last week's exercise on Zara and Patagonia, you may recall that it was quite hard to figure out for each company what the goals actually are, and also what the goals actually should be. This means that it's really hard to figure out even the rank ordering of goals, let alone some kind of quantitative weighting like the one that we saw for Twitter, that will let us do some real rigorous choosing between strategies like what you see above. So in reality, even at a mature tech company like Twitter, the weighting of goals might be more like this, where they care about users and they care about profit, but they don't really know which one's more important and how much more important. So the company in this case, if it doesn't really know whether users are more important than profit and how much more important than profit, the company has not really made clear what's most important among its goals. And this accidental uncertainty about goals is not so far from reality in many organizations that we're in, or that we see, or that we analyze. This is relevant to strategy because, if you recall, strategy is simply choosing actions to take in order to achieve goals that you want. And it's relevant to strategy because you can't choose actions properly if you don't know what goals you want to achieve, or in this case, how much you want to achieve them. Now, all this may seem very far away from the key questions you want to ask in doing strategic analysis, and I want to bring it back to that. The reason why this is connected to kind of fundamental underlying questions around strategic analysis is because whether a situation is risky or uncertain affects how you do strategic analysis to figure out how to act strategically in that situation. So if the situation is risky, and again, remember that risk is basically certainty. It's when you don't know what will happen, but you can quantify how likely the different outcomes are and how likely the different outcomes probabilities are. If the situation is risky like that, then the assumptions of conventional strategy are valid, and so conventional strategy is helpful. Now, there are many situations that are risky, such as situations that depend on the physical properties of objects. For instance, champagne and the bursting of bottles that are under pressure from inside. The proportion of bursting bottles is practically constant and known, given control over the glass composition and the bottle shape. And so you can accommodate this proportion of bursting bottles in production, regardless of the size of production. Another example is that of fire risk, which is different from champagne, but is similar in the sense that you don't know whether a building will catch fire. But by adding knowledge of risk factors that you understand from large populations of buildings that have or have not caught fire, you can understand whether or not any particular building is at risk of fire and how much. So some of these risk factors might include things like whether it is made of wood, whether it's got a fire suppression system, or whether it's located next to something which regularly catches fire, like a fireworks factory, for instance. To summarize all this, the first key question of strategic analysis is what type of goal is a business pursuing? Are they relatively superordinate or relatively subordinate goals? And this matters to how and how easily these goals can be achieved, especially under situations of uncertainty. The second key question, obviously, is whether the business is facing a risky, in other words, actually certain situation, or if it's facing an uncertain situation. Let's go deeper now into what uncertainty is and how you can detect when a situation is uncertain. Situations can be truly uncertain in three main ways. The first way is we're uncertain about what actions are possible. The second is if we're uncertain about what outcomes a particular action will produce. And third is if we're uncertain about what goals, in other words, what outcomes we actually want to achieve. At this point, you should stop to think back about how we illustrated the problem with uncertainty and conventional strategic decision making based on probabilities in the light of these three ways that situations can be truly uncertain. You might want to take a pause to do that right now by stopping this video. Okay, now let's illustrate each one of these. Uncertainty about possible actions simply means you know only some of the possible actions you could take. Now, a real life example of this might be if you wanted to achieve the goal of going to university and previously thought the only way to do it was to focus on getting good grades in a standardized exam to get into your home country's universities, not knowing that you could also take the SATs and apply to university in the US, for example. Uncertainty about possible actions simply means not knowing that there are other things that you could do that may help you achieve the goals that you're trying to achieve. Uncertainty about possible outcomes simply means that you know what actions you can take already, but you don't know what outcomes they might result in. For instance, if you're looking for an internship at an investment bank, you might know about the idea of doing more extracurriculars to boost your CV, but you don't know how much doing these extracurriculars will help. And you don't know how much doing specific extracurriculars will help. So how much time should you spend strategically doing extracurriculars, and which extracurriculars should you do? These are open questions that are definitely strategic, but they're also really relevant, as I've said before, not only to business, but also to your personal career development and your personal choices right now. And finally, we return to the example of being uncertain about goals in the first place. And we've talked about this in great detail so far. Situations are almost never only risky or only uncertain. You can now think back to the Twitter example again. Options 1 and 2 are pretty understandable from a risk perspective. All you have to do is calculate the expected 10-year profit by looking at the probability of success that you see on the screen, and you can compare options 1 and 2 in terms of what you expect your profit will be like over 10 years. And you can choose between them as a result. However, option 3, as we've already said, is incalculable using this method because you don't understand the probability of success for option 3. So this is a situation which you cannot call certainty. And it is also not purely a situation of risk, which is ultimately calculable. As you may have noticed already, when some true uncertainty shows up, which in this case is provided by option 3, it kind of contaminates the situation and makes the whole situation truly uncertain. So uncertainty and risk often co-occur. Situations are almost always partly risky and partly uncertain. And in fact, you can never be sure if a situation is truly risky or if it's truly uncertain. If conventional strategy only really works under risk and not under uncertainty, what should you do in these three truly uncertain situations? The conventional strategic approach doesn't really help you answer this question. So the takeaway here is that uncertain situations require a fundamentally different approach to strategy than the conventional approach. Design, like strategy, I keep saying, is about figuring out how to act to change an existing situation into a desired one. And the design approach therefore comes maybe a bit to the rescue. In the first two lectures, I mentioned that part of design's contribution to fixing strategy was in focusing and making explicit the goals that strategy is pursuing. Another aspect of why design is important in strategy is because design as a process is often applied in situations where uncertainty is clearly present. So design processes, in other words, how design is actually done, has had to learn how to work with uncertainty and not simply assume it doesn't exist, as conventional strategy often does. Now, if you think back to Porter's approach to strategy, it basically involves doing a bunch of brain work at the beginning and then coming up with a very complicated to describe and implement set of activities. If you do all of them right, you've got an amazing defensible strategy. This is sort of the approach of conventional strategy, and what I'm trying to convey is the sense that conventional strategy pushes businesses to invest in big, detailed, complicated planning that results in big, detailed, complicated actions that are decided upfront and then implemented. This creates a kind of rigid strategy, which is obviously not very useful when the situation changes all the time and is uncertain. So if you want an analogy, conventional strategy is like someone lecturing at you with a fixed idea at the beginning. The design approach, on the other hand, might be better described as a conversation where along the way there are discoveries of points of interest, there are clarifications, and the eventual point you end at is co-constructed in itself, not predictable at the beginning. This is what, in the optional reading this week from Donald Sean, is described as a reflective conversation with the situation. The situation, of course, is the problem with all its constraints and resources. And conversing here means interacting with the situation, trying to understand its dimensions and what makes it tick. And this is the kind of strategic analysis this and the next lecture are talking about. But what actually makes the conversation reflective? Now, you may want to pause here for a moment again by stopping the video to think about what the difference is between a regular conversation and a conversation that's reflective. What's reflective about this process is that part of the conversation with the situation is about being open to changing your mind. And what you're open to changing your mind about is things like, what is the goal and what is the definition of success? What are the resources we have available to play with? What are the constraints that we work under? And most importantly, what actions are actually possible to us? This open-mindedness, which is part of reflection and action, is why this way of thinking about strategy leads to exploration about what goals might be, about what resources might be, about what constraints might be, and about what actions are possible. And this exploration is where creativity and innovation in strategy can come from. Stepping back, the design perspective on strategy sees strategy as a dynamic and ongoing process. That's how it's different from the conventional view of strategy as a specific and usually quite static set of things you do in order to succeed. The design approach to strategy as a process has several key characteristics. It is iterative and fluid. It begins without great commitment, only gradually increasing commitment to particular courses of action over time. And it increases commitment to particular courses of action by trying different paths out, right? It tries different ways of doing things to see whether those things work. And in seeing whether those things work and changing what actions it takes, it's actually responding to the results of these trials. What this means is, one aspect of strategy as reflection and action is that it's actively investigating both the problems and the goals and constantly reframing problems and goals. It's moving back and forth between solving local problems and global problems and trying to see the connections between the local and the global level. So in summary for this week, the first key question of strategic analysis is, what kind of goal are you trying to pursue? Superordinate goals generally are more abstract and high level, and so their virtue is that they leave you more room to play with. You have more freedom to try things out, learn about the specific situation, and respond to new discoveries that you make about the situation. Now, this is only comparatively useful when the situation is uncertain, because when the situation is merely risky and when the uncertainty is quantifiable, your understanding of the situation is much greater. And as a result, goals that are more concrete, they're lower level, they're more subordinate, they can be more viable in a situation that is risky and more knowable than an uncertain situation. So of course, the second key question of strategic analysis is the situation risky or uncertain? Risk is not the same as true uncertainty, because risk is ultimately measurable uncertainty that you can get rid of by planning based on expectations. True uncertainty, on the other hand, cannot be quantified, and you can't get rid of it the same way you can get rid of risk. Uncertainty basically makes strategy difficult because it messes up a lot of the assumptions that conventional strategy makes. Now, situations can be uncertain in three main ways. You can be uncertain about what actions are possible in a given situation. You can be uncertain about what outcomes an action will produce in a given situation. And you can also be uncertain about what goals, in other words, what outcomes you want to achieve in a given situation. The design approach is a way to fix or upgrade conventional strategy to be more suitable for uncertain situations. Because when the situation is truly uncertain, conventional strategy breaks down. The design approach to taking action, in other words, the design approach to strategy, is more appropriate to true uncertainty because it involves having a reflective conversation with the situation and pursuing relatively more superordinated goals. This allows you as a strategist to enter into an uncertain situation and gradually figure things out without assuming that you know what the situation is like or what the future is like. So that was a very quick run through of two main questions to ask yourself before you even begin doing the strategic analysis about your particular situation. So this week's lecture was about how to think about the situation you're going to analyze. And next week, we're going to go to the actual meat of it, how you do the strategic analysis of that situation so that you can think concretely about making plans to act on it to achieve the outcomes that you want. Until then, have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.